There exists a moment in deep time that anthropologists call the Great Transition, a period roughly 2.5 million years ago when something happened to a lineage of apes in East Africa, something that had never happened before in the 4 billion-year history of life on Earth. And what makes this moment so strange and so difficult to fully comprehend is not just that these apes began to use tools because other animals used tools, not just that they began to walk upright because they had been doing that for millions of years already, but that something shifted in their consciousness, in their relationship to the world, in their ability to imagine and plan and create in ways that seem to transcend pure biological necessity. And we call the beings that emerged from this transition humans. And we tell ourselves stories about how this happened, stories about evolutionary pressure and natural selection and adaptive advantage. But if you really sit with the evidence, if you look at what the fossil record and the archaeological sites actually show you, there is something that doesn't quite add up, something that feels almost like a gap or a jump that our neat evolutionary narratives struggle to explain. The Pleistocene epoch, which began 2.6 million years ago and ended only 11,700 years ago, was the crucible in which humanity was forged. This was the age of ice, when massive glaciers advanced and retreated across the northern continents in cycles that lasted tens of thousands of years. And between these glacial periods, there were warmer interglacials, when the ice retreated and forests spread and animals and early humans moved north following the changing climate. And this oscillation between ice and warmth, between scarcity and abundance, created a kind of environmental pressure cooker that forced our ancestors to adapt or die. And the ones who survived were the ones who could think ahead, who could plan for winter, who could cooperate in larger groups, who could communicate complex ideas. And over time, these selective pressures shaped not just our bodies, but our minds, creating the cognitive architecture that we still carry today. But here is where it gets strange. The first stone tools appear in the archaeological record about 3.3 million years ago in Kenya. Simple flakes knocked off larger stones to create sharp edges for cutting. And these tools are remarkable not because they are sophisticated, they are not, but because they demonstrate intentionality, planning, the understanding that a rock could be transformed into something useful. And the beings who made these tools were not yet human in the modern sense. They were Australopithecines, or early members of the genus Homo, creatures with brains about 1/3 the size of ours. And yet they had this spark, this ability to see potential in the material world. And then, for almost 1 million years, the tools barely changed, generation after generation, making the same simple flakes, using the same techniques. And this stasis is puzzling, because if tool use was such an adaptive advantage, why didn't it evolve faster? Why didn't innovation accelerate? And then something happened. Around 2 million years ago, a new species appeared in the fossil record, Homo erectus. And these beings were different. They were taller, more robust, with larger brains about 900 cubic centimeters compared to 500 for earlier hominins. And they made more sophisticated tools, hand axes that were carefully shaped on both sides to create sharp edges and pointed tips. And these hand axes spread across Africa and eventually into Asia and Europe. And Homo erectus was the first hominin to leave Africa to colonize new continents. And this expansion required not just physical adaptations, but cognitive ones. The ability to navigate unfamiliar terrain, to adapt to new climates, to remember water sources and seasonal patterns across vast distances. But what caused this leap? What happened around 2 million years ago that created a species so much more capable than what came before? The standard explanation is that climate change created new selective pressures. The African environment was becoming more arid, more seasonal, and this favored individuals who could hunt cooperatively, who could use tools more effectively, who could plan and communicate. And this explanation makes sense as far as it goes, but it feels incomplete. Because evolution is gradual. It works through small, incremental changes over many generations. And the jump from Australopithecus to Homo erectus feels almost too abrupt, too discontinuous. And some researchers have wondered whether there was something else, some additional factor that we are missing. There are controversial theories that most mainstream anthropologists dismiss, but that refuse to entirely go away. Ideas about genetic mutations that affected brain development in ways that were more dramatic than usual. Or about environmental factors, like changes in diet, the inclusion of more meat and bone marrow that provided the nutrients necessary for larger brains. Or even more speculative ideas about population bottlenecks, where small groups developed novel behaviors that then spread as those groups multiplied. And I am not saying these theories are correct. I am just noting that there is something about the human origin story that feels not quite resolved. A sense that the available evidence doesn't completely explain the magnitude of the transformation. The world that Homo erectus inhabited was dramatically different from ours. This was the Pleistocene, a world of megafauna where giant mammals dominated the landscape in ways that seem almost fantastical now. There were mammoths and mastodons, towering elephantine creatures covered in thick fur adapted to the cold. There were giant ground sloths, the size of elephants, moving slowly through South American forests. There were saber-toothed cats with canine teeth 20 centimeters long, designed for piercing the thick hides of mega-herbivores. There were giant bears and giant beavers and giant armadillos, and everywhere you looked, the scale was just bigger than what we are used to. And early humans lived among these creatures, not as dominant predators, but as one species among many, vulnerable to the same predators, competing for the same resources. Imagine what it must have been like to be Homo erectus on the African savanna 1 million years ago. You are part of a small group, maybe 20 or 30 individuals. Your band includes children who need constant protection, elders who have knowledge but limited mobility, and adults who do the bulk of the hunting and gathering. You have stone tools, hand axes and scrapers that you carry with you or cache in strategic locations. And you have fire. This is important. Homo erectus was almost certainly using controlled fire by 1 million years ago, and possibly earlier. And fire changed everything. Fire provided warmth in cold climates, allowing expansion into temperate and even subarctic zones. Fire provided protection from predators, creating a safe space where the group could sleep without constant vigilance. Fire allowed cooking, which made food more digestible and more nutritious, and which may have further driven brain expansion. But fire also did something else, something less tangible. It created a focal point for the group, a place where people gathered in the evening after the day's activities. And around that fire, stories were told, or at least proto-stories. Because Homo erectus probably did not have language in the modern sense. Their vocal anatomy suggests they could make sounds, but probably not the full range of phonemes that modern humans use. But they could gesture, they could act out, they could use sounds and expressions to convey meaning. And sitting around the fire in the darkness, with the sounds of dangerous animals prowling just beyond the light, the group would communicate. They would reinforce social bonds. They would teach the young about dangers and opportunities. And in doing this, they were creating culture. Not yet the rich, symbolic culture of modern humans, but something, a foundation. The night would have been different then, without artificial light beyond the fire, without any understanding of what stars were, or why the moon changed shape. The darkness was total and full of mystery. And I think this must have shaped early human psychology in ways we can barely imagine now. Because we live in a world that is never truly dark. Even in rural areas there is light pollution, and we understand or think we understand what is out there in the dark. It is just more of the same world we see during the day. But for Homo erectus, the night was unknowable. It was when predators hunted, when strange sounds echoed across the savanna, when the only safety was the fire and the group. And this must have created a kind of existential anxiety, a constant, low-level awareness of vulnerability and mortality. And yet, there was also wonder. The night sky in the Pleistocene, before any atmospheric pollution, before any artificial light, would have been spectacular beyond our ability to really conceive. The Milky Way would have been a bright river across the sky, Individual stars would have been brilliant, and early humans must have looked up at this display and wondered what it was. They did not have the concepts to understand stars as distant suns or the Milky Way as a galaxy, but they could see patterns. They could notice that certain stars appeared in certain seasons, that the moon waxed and waned in a regular cycle, and these observations were useful. They helped with navigation and with tracking the passage of time, but they also must have provoked something deeper, a sense that there was an order to things, a pattern beyond immediate experience. There is evidence, though controversial, that some early humans engaged in what we might call proto-religious or symbolic behavior. There are sites where unusual objects were collected, colorful stones or fossils, things that had no obvious practical use. And some researchers interpret this as evidence of aesthetic sense or symbolic thinking, the ability to recognize that an object could be meaningful beyond its utilitarian function. And there are also sites that might be early graves, places where bodies were deliberately placed, though without the elaborate burial goods that appear later. And if these are graves, and not all researchers agree that they are, then they suggest an awareness of death as something different from mere absence, an understanding that the dead were once like us, and now are something else, and perhaps a belief, or at least a hope, that death was not the absolute end. But I am getting ahead of myself, because Homo erectus persisted for over 1.5 million years, an enormously successful species by any measure, far more successful than Homo sapiens has been so far. We have only been around for 300,000 years, and during this immense span of time, Homo erectus spread across the Old World. Their fossils have been found in Africa, in Georgia, in China, in Java, and each population adapted to local conditions, and there was variation. Some populations were taller, some had more robust bones, some developed slightly different tool traditions. And this variation is what we would expect from populations separated by vast distances and evolving in different environments. And eventually, this variation became significant enough that new species emerged. Or at least, that is how paleoanthropologists classify them. Species like Homo heidelbergensis in Africa and Europe, Homo erectus in Asia. And eventually, these lineages would give rise to Neanderthals and Denisovans, and finally to us, Homo sapiens. The appearance of Homo sapiens around 300,000 years ago in Africa is another one of those transition points that feels significant. Our brains are not that much larger than Homo heidelbergensis, the immediate ancestor species, maybe 1,500 cubic centimeters compared to 1,200 or 1,300. And our bodies are actually somewhat more gracile, less robust. And yet something was different. The archaeological record shows a fluorescence of new behaviors around this time or shortly after. More sophisticated tools, the use of pigments, the creation of what might be art or at least decoration. And then around 70,000 years ago, there is what some researchers call the Great Leap Forward, or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, though these terms are contentious. A rapid increase in cultural complexity, elaborate tools, clear evidence of art and music, long-distance trade networks, and most significantly, fully modern language. Language is the key. This is what separates us from every other species, including our closest relatives, the Neanderthals, who had large brains and sophisticated tools, but who may have lacked the full syntactic complexity of modern human language. Language allows us to communicate not just about the present, but about the past and future. Not just about concrete things, but about abstract concepts. Not just facts, but stories, hypotheticals, counterfactuals. And language allows knowledge to accumulate across generations, because each generation can build on what the previous generation learned. And this cumulative cultural evolution is what enabled humans to eventually dominate the planet. Not because we were stronger or faster or had better senses than other animals, but because we could cooperate in larger groups, coordinate complex activities, and transmit increasingly sophisticated knowledge from generation to generation. But where did language come from? This is one of the great unsolved mysteries. Because language does not fossilize, we cannot dig up ancient words or grammar. All we have are indirect clues, changes in skull shape that suggest changes in vocal anatomy, the appearance of a small bone called the hyoid, which supports the tongue, and which in modern form first appears in Homo sapiens, and the archaeological evidence of increasingly complex behaviors, which presumably required increasingly complex communication. But the actual origin point, the moment when pre-linguistic communication became true language, this is lost to us. And it may have been gradual, a slow accumulation of vocabulary and grammatical structures over tens of thousands of years, or it may have been relatively rapid, a genetic mutation affecting brain structure that created the capacity for syntax and recursion. And we simply do not know which it was. There is something almost mystical about this moment, the birth of language. Because language is not just a tool for communication, it is the medium of thought itself, at least for abstract thought. Try to think about mathematics or philosophy, or even your plans for tomorrow without using language. It is very difficult. Language structures how we perceive and categorize the world, and the emergence of language was the emergence of a new kind of consciousness, a self-aware, reflective consciousness that could examine its own thoughts. And with this consciousness came questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? What happens when we die? What is the meaning of the patterns we see in nature? And these questions are uniquely human as far as we know. No other animal asks them, and they emerge directly from our linguistic capacity. And so around 70,000 years ago, or perhaps earlier, we have people who are essentially modern, anatomically and cognitively indistinguishable from us, living in small bands of hunter-gatherers, moving seasonally across landscapes they know intimately, and their lives are hard by our standards. Infant mortality is high. Average lifespan is perhaps 30 or 35 years, though if you survive childhood you might live to 50 or 60. Injuries and infections that would be trivial now are often fatal, and there is always the threat of starvation, or predation, or violence from other human groups. And yet there is also evidence that these people had time for non-utilitarian activities. They made art, carved figurines, and painted cave walls. They made music. Bone flutes have been found dating to 40,000 years ago. They cared for their disabled and elderly. There are skeletons showing healed injuries that would have required months of care, and they buried their dead with grave goods suggesting belief in an afterlife, or at least a desire to honor the deceased. The famous cave paintings of Europe, Lascaux and Chauvet and Altamira, dating from roughly 30,000 to 15,000 years ago, are windows into the minds of these people. And what is striking about the paintings is their quality. These are not crude stick figures. They are sophisticated artworks showing animals in motion with accurate anatomy and a sense of depth and perspective. And the locations are significant. These are not casual doodles on any available surface. The paintings are deep inside caves, in chambers that are difficult to access, places that would have been utterly dark, requiring torches or lamps to see. And this suggests that the act of creating these images was ritualistic, that the caves were sacred spaces, and that the images themselves had meaning beyond mere representation. But what meaning? We cannot know for certain. The people who made these paintings left no written records, and their descendants, the modern inhabitants of Europe, have no direct cultural continuity with the Paleolithic. Too much time has passed, too many migrations and replacements, and so we are left to speculate. Some researchers think the paintings were hunting magic, representations of prey animals intended to ensure successful hunts. Others think they were shamanistic, created during altered states of consciousness as part of religious rituals. Still others think they were simply art, beautiful for its own sake, or perhaps some combination of all these things. And the truth is that the paintings probably meant different things to different people, and that meaning evolved over the thousands of years during which the caves were used. But I think there is something else in these paintings, something that speaks to the human condition in a way that transcends time and culture. They are expressions of the desire to make permanent what is transient, to capture and preserve a moment of experience. The artist who painted the horses at Chauvet 32,000 years ago saw those horses, alive and moving across the landscape, and wanted to preserve that image, wanted to say, "I saw this, and it was beautiful, or powerful, or important." And this is fundamentally the same impulse that drives art today. The desire to communicate experience, to say, "This is what it is like to be me, to see what I see, to feel what I feel." And in doing so, to create a bridge between minds, to achieve a kind of communion that transcends the isolation of individual consciousness. The Pleistocene world was vast and largely empty of humans. Even at our peak before the invention of agriculture, the global human population was probably no more than 5 or 10 million people, scattered across Africa and Eurasia and Australia in small bands. Most bands probably consisted of 20 to 50 individuals, extended family groups that moved seasonally within a defined territory, and these bands were mostly isolated from each other. You might encounter another band a few times a year at resource-rich locations where multiple groups gathered, and these encounters could be peaceful, opportunities for trade and intermarriage, or they could be violent, conflicts over resources or perceived insults, and both cooperation and conflict shaped human evolution, selecting for individuals who could navigate complex social situations, who could form alliances and detect deception and enforce norms of reciprocity. And yet, despite this isolation, there was also connection. Archaeological evidence shows trade networks spanning hundreds of kilometers. Obsidian from specific volcanic sources found far from those sources. Seashells used as beads or ornaments found at inland sites. And this tells us that objects, and possibly ideas, were moving between groups, passed from band to band in a slow diffusion. And over time, this created a degree of cultural homogeneity within regions. Shared tool types, shared artistic motifs, possibly shared languages or language families. And this process of cultural diffusion and diversification is part of what makes the archaeological record so complex. Because populations were not isolated and static, they were constantly interacting, splitting, merging, replacing one another. The end of the Pleistocene came abruptly. Around 11,700 years ago, the last glacial period ended. Temperatures rose, the great ice sheets that covered northern Europe and North America melted. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, flooding coastal plains and creating new coastlines. And the megafauna began to disappear. Within a few thousand years, most of the large mammals that had dominated the Pleistocene went extinct. Mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and many others. And the cause of this extinction is still debated. Climate change certainly played a role. As environments shifted rapidly, some species could not adapt. But human hunting also contributed, and possibly diseases introduced by human migration, and the combination of these factors created an extinction event that fundamentally changed the world's ecosystems. And humans changed too, or rather, human society changed. With the end of the Ice Age and the extinction of megafauna, the hunting strategies that had worked for tens of thousands of years became less effective. And in some regions, particularly in the Middle East, people began to experiment with new subsistence strategies. Instead of following herds of wild animals, they began to stay in one place and encourage certain plants to grow. They began to select seeds from the most productive plants and save them for planting the next season. And over time, this artificial selection created domesticated crops, wheat and barley and lentils, that were more productive than their wild ancestors. And this was the beginning of agriculture, the Neolithic Revolution, and it would transform human society even more profoundly than the cognitive revolution that created language. But that is another story, and what I want to focus on is this moment at the end of the Pleistocene, this transition from the world that humanity evolved in to the world we created, because I think there is something important here about human nature and about the strange trajectory we have been on. The Pleistocene was the world we were made for in a biological sense. Our bodies and brains were shaped by 2.5 million years of that environment. And yet, it is a world that no longer exists. We have created something entirely different, and there is a mismatch between what we are adapted for and the world we now inhabit. And this mismatch is the source of much of our modern malaise. The Pleistocene human lived in small groups where everyone knew everyone else, where social interactions were face-to-face, where status and reputation mattered intensely because your survival depended on your relationships. And we still crave this. We still form tight-knit groups. We still care intensely about what others think of us. But now, we live in vast, anonymous societies where we interact with thousands of people, most of whom we will never see again. And our brains struggle to make sense of this. We treat online interactions as if they were face-to-face, even though they are not. We form parasocial relationships with celebrities and influencers who do not know we exist. And we experience status anxiety in ways that make no sense in practical terms, but that make perfect sense if you understand that our brains are still running Pleistocene social software. The Pleistocene human was physically active, walking many kilometers every day, engaging in varied movement, climbing, carrying, throwing. And their diet was diverse, whatever was available seasonally, meat and fish and plants and insects, and their lives had a natural rhythm, active during the day, sleeping when it got dark. And we are not adapted for sedentary life, or for processed foods high in sugar and fat, or for artificial light that disrupts our circadian rhythms. And the chronic diseases that plague modern society, obesity and diabetes and heart disease, these are largely diseases of mismatch, the result of Pleistocene bodies trying to function in a modern environment. But perhaps more profound than the physical mismatch is the psychological one. The Pleistocene human lived in a world of immediate, concrete reality. They faced real physical challenges and dangers, hunger and cold and predators, and they solved these problems through direct action. And when they succeeded, there was immediate, tangible feedback. You found food, or you did not. You survived the night, or you did not. And this created a kind of existential clarity that we lack. Our problems now are abstract and diffuse: climate change and economic inequality and political dysfunction. And the solutions, if they exist, require collective action at scales we cannot perceive. And we feel helpless and anxious because our brains are not designed for this. They are designed for solving concrete, immediate problems in small groups. And when we cannot do that, we suffer. And yet I do not think the solution is to romanticize the past or to wish we could return to a Pleistocene lifestyle, because that world was also harsh and violent and short, and most of us would not survive a week in actual Pleistocene conditions. But I do think there is value in understanding where we came from, in recognizing that the strange, restless, dissatisfied consciousness that characterizes much of modern life is not a personal failing, but a consequence of the mismatch between our evolutionary heritage and our current circumstances. And maybe in that understanding, there is some peace, some acceptance that we are creatures out of time, shaped for a world that no longer exists, stumbling forward into a future we cannot predict, carrying with us the gifts and curses of our Pleistocene ancestors, language and art and consciousness, and all the existential questions they bring, forever seeking meaning in a universe that may not provide it, forever building fires against the dark, and telling stories to make sense of the mystery of our existence. There is a theory in anthropology called the Toba catastrophe theory that I find fascinating, though also somewhat speculative. It proposes that around 70,000 years ago, the eruption of the Toba supervolcano in Sumatra caused a volcanic winter that lasted 6 to 10 years, drastically reducing global temperatures and causing widespread ecological collapse, and that this catastrophe reduced the human population to perhaps as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals, a genetic bottleneck from which all modern humans descend. And the evidence for this is mixed. Genetic studies show that modern humans have surprisingly low genetic diversity, suggesting a population bottleneck at some point. But whether it was specifically caused by Toba or by other factors is uncertain. But what intrigues me about this theory is not whether it is literally true, but what it tells us about human vulnerability and resilience. Imagine being part of that remnant population. Assuming the theory is correct, you are one of perhaps a few thousand humans left alive in the entire world. Your environment has been devastated. The sun is obscured by volcanic ash. Temperatures have plummeted. Plants are dying. Animals are dying, and you have no understanding of what has happened, no framework to make sense of the global catastrophe. It must have seemed like the end of the world. And yet, your ancestors survived. They adapted. They cooperated. They shared resources when they must have been tempted to hoard. They cared for children and elders who could not contribute directly to survival. And slowly, over generations, the population recovered. And from that small remnant came all of us, everyone alive today. And I find something moving in that. The idea that we are all related, all descended from that small group of survivors who refused to give up. And this is a pattern that repeats throughout history. Humans facing catastrophe and somehow enduring. The ice ages advanced, and we survived. Megafauna went extinct, and we adapted. Climate changed, and we changed with it. And we did this not because we were the strongest or the fastest, but because we could cooperate and communicate and imagine possibilities beyond our immediate circumstances. And these capacities that emerged during the Pleistocene are still with us. They are our inheritance. And the question is whether they will be sufficient for the challenges we face now. Challenges that are no longer about survival in a harsh environment, but about managing the consequences of our own success, about living sustainably on a finite planet, about creating societies that are just and fulfilling. And I do not know if we will succeed. History suggests that civilizations often fail, but history also shows that humans are remarkably adaptive. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the same qualities that carried us through the Pleistocene will carry us through whatever comes next. When I think about the first humans, not Homo sapiens specifically, but the whole lineage, Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis and the others, I think about what it must have felt like to be at that threshold, to be almost human but not quite, to have a consciousness that was more sophisticated than any animal but less sophisticated than ours, to ask questions but lack the conceptual framework to answer them. And I wonder if there was a sense of incompleteness, a feeling that something was missing, or whether they were content in their immediate experience, untroubled by the existential anxieties that plague us. And probably it is the latter. Probably the sense of incompleteness is itself a product of fully modern human consciousness, the curse that comes with language and abstract thought, the awareness of all that we do not know and cannot control. But there must have been something, some spark, some sense that they were different from the other animals. Homo erectus controlled fire, and fire is not just a tool. It is a piece of the sun brought down to earth. It is a transformation of matter, wood becoming heat and light. And they must have recognized this as significant, must have felt some sense of wonder or power in their ability to create and control it. And around those fires, in the darkness, with the unknown beyond the circle of light, they became human. Or at least, they took another step toward becoming human. And the journey they began is one we are still on, still trying to understand what it means to be conscious, to be aware of our own existence and mortality, to be capable of both extraordinary cooperation and extraordinary cruelty, to be the species that paints cave walls and builds cathedrals and writes symphonies, and also the species that wages war and destroys environments and creates weapons capable of ending all life on Earth. We are the inheritors of the Pleistocene, carriers of a legacy that stretches back millions of years. And we are also something new, something that could not have been predicted. And where we go from here is uncertain. But the story of how we got here, the long, slow journey from ape-like ancestors to modern humans, is a story worth knowing, worth contemplating, because it tells us something about who we are and where we came from. And maybe, in understanding that, we can chart a better course forward. Or maybe the whole enterprise of understanding is itself just another human peculiarity, another manifestation of the consciousness that emerged during the Pleistocene, asking questions that have no answers, seeking meaning in a universe that simply is, but asking anyway. Because that is what we do. That is what it means to be human. And though the world we evolved for is gone, replaced by something stranger and more complex, we remain, still wondering, still seeking, still lighting fires against the dark, waiting for a dawn that may or may not come. There is an archaeological site in Siberia called Denisova Cave that has yielded some of the most perplexing evidence about human origins. The cave sits in the Altai Mountains, and it has been occupied on and off for perhaps 300,000 years. And in the sediments of this cave, archaeologists have found bones and DNA from not just modern humans and Neanderthals, but from another species, or subspecies, that we did not even know existed until 2008, when a finger bone was discovered and sequenced. And this species has been named Denisovans after the cave. And what we know about them comes almost entirely from DNA, because we have only a handful of fossils, a finger bone, some teeth, part of a skull. And yet the genetic evidence tells us that they were widespread across Asia, that they interbred with both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and that their genes persist in modern populations, particularly in Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians who carry 5 to 6% Denisovan DNA. This discovery changed everything we thought we knew about human evolution, because the old model was relatively simple. Modern humans evolved in Africa, left Africa around 60,000 years ago, encountered Neanderthals in Europe and the Middle East, interbred with them to a limited degree, and then Neanderthals went extinct. But now we know the picture was much more complex. There were multiple human species coexisting, not just in different regions, but sometimes in the same regions. Denisova Cave itself shows evidence of all three groups at different times, and probably there were other species we have not discovered yet because the fossil record is so fragmentary. And these different groups were not completely isolated. They met and interbred, and the children of these unions were viable and fertile, which technically means they were all the same species according to the biological species concept. But they were distinct enough that we can identify them genetically, and this blurs the line between species and subspecies in ways that make taxonomy complicated. And there is something haunting about the Denisovans, because we know they existed, we know they had culture and tools, we know they interbred with our ancestors, and yet we do not know what they looked like. The few fragments we have suggest they were large and robust, but beyond that, we are guessing. And they left no art as far as we know, no cave paintings or carvings, or perhaps they did and we have not recognized it. Or perhaps they expressed themselves in ways that did not preserve, song or dance or body painting. And so they exist in this liminal space, not quite real because we cannot visualize them, but undeniably part of our heritage. Their DNA flowing through millions of people alive today, silent witnesses to encounters that happened 50,000 years ago in the mountains and valleys of Asia. I think about those encounters sometimes. What must it have been like when a band of Homo sapiens encountered a group of Denisovans? They would have recognized each other as similar, both bipedal, both using tools and fire, both clearly intelligent, but also different. Different body proportions, different facial features, possibly different vocal ranges or gestures. And there would have been a moment of decision: fight or flee, or attempt communication. And sometimes they chose communication, chose cooperation. And those choices led to interbreeding. And I wonder if there was love in those encounters, or if it was something else. Expedience, or curiosity, or coercion. We cannot know. But the result was that our species absorbed genetic material from these archaic humans, and some of that material was beneficial. Genes related to immune function that helped us adapt to new pathogens. Genes related to altitude adaptation that are common in Tibetan populations today. And this genetic legacy suggests that the encounter between species was not just violent competition, but also exchange, a mingling that made us more adaptable, more diverse. But the Denisovans disappeared, or rather they were absorbed, their distinct identity lost as their populations interbred with the expanding Homo sapiens. And the same happened to Neanderthals, and to any other archaic human groups that existed. By 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was the only human species left, And this raises uncomfortable questions about whether we outcompeted them, or killed them, or simply absorbed them through interbreeding. And the answer is probably all three in different times and places, but the end result was the same. We became the sole survivors of a once diverse family tree. And whether this was inevitable, whether it was a result of our superior adaptability or just chance, this is debated. And maybe the question itself is wrong. Maybe there is no grand narrative, just a series of local events and contingencies that happen to result in our survival and their extinction. The Neanderthals are better known than the Denisovans because we have more fossils and more archaeological sites. They lived in Europe and Western Asia from about 400,000 years ago until their extinction around 40,000 years ago. And for a long time, they were portrayed as brutish and primitive, the caveman stereotype. But modern research has completely overturned this image. Neanderthals had brains as large or larger than ours. They made sophisticated tools. They controlled fire. They cared for their sick and injured. There are skeletons showing healed fractures that would have required months of care. They buried their dead, and some sites suggest grave goods, though this is controversial. They used pigments, possibly for body decoration. They made ornaments from shells and feathers. And at least one site in Spain shows evidence that they created abstract markings on cave walls. 6 red dots arranged in a pattern, and this was dated to 65,000 years ago, before modern humans arrived in Europe. So Neanderthals had culture, they had symbolic thought, and yet they went extinct while we survived. And this has generated endless speculation about what made us different. Some researchers point to language, arguing that even if Neanderthals could communicate, they may have lacked the syntactic complexity of modern human language. Others point to social organization, suggesting that Homo sapiens lived in larger, more interconnected groups, which allowed for more innovation and more rapid spread of useful technologies. Still, others argue that the difference was marginal, that Neanderthals were not significantly inferior, and that their extinction was largely a matter of bad luck, being in the wrong place when climate shifted, or when modern humans arrived with new diseases. And there is genetic evidence that some Neanderthals had red hair and pale skin, adaptations to low UV environments in Ice Age Europe, and they probably had diverse phenotypes just as modern humans do. Some groups more robust, some more gracile. And if we could see them alive, dressed in modern clothing, we might not immediately recognize them as different. The differences were subtle. A more projecting face, a larger nose, a more robust skeleton, but still clearly human. And this makes their extinction more poignant somehow. They were so close to us, close enough to interbreed, close enough that their genes survive in us, and yet they are gone, and we remain. And there is something about this that feels not quite earned, as if we won a competition we did not deserve to win. But perhaps this is projection. Perhaps I am imposing modern guilt onto events that were morally neutral. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were both trying to survive in difficult environments, and when they encountered each other, they did what organisms do, competed for resources, sometimes cooperated, sometimes fought. And over tens of thousands of years, one population gradually replaced the other, not through a single genocide, but through countless small advantages in birth rates or survival rates or technological innovation. And the Neanderthals faded, but not completely, because we carry them with us. 1 to 4% of the genome of everyone of non-African descent is Neanderthal. And this means that in a very real sense, they are not extinct. They live on in us. And maybe that is a form of immortality, not the kind they would have wanted necessarily, but something. The question of what happened when modern humans and Neanderthals met has been the subject of numerous studies and debates, and the evidence is complex and sometimes contradictory. There are sites in the Levant where modern humans and Neanderthals seem to have alternated control over the same territories. One group present for a few thousand years, then the other, suggesting that neither had a decisive advantage. And there are sites in Europe where modern human artifacts appear and Neanderthal artifacts disappear relatively quickly, suggesting replacement. And then there is the genetic evidence of interbreeding, which happened multiple times in multiple locations, and which suggests at least some degree of peaceful interaction, or at least non-lethal interaction. One of the most intriguing sites is in France, a cave called Grotte Mondrin, where archaeologists found a single tooth from a modern human child dated to 54,000 years ago, surrounded by layers containing Neanderthal artifacts. And this suggests that modern humans were present in Europe much earlier than previously thought, and that they coexisted with Neanderthals for thousands of years longer than we realized. And what were those thousands of years like? Did the two groups live in the same valleys, hunt the same game, trade with each other, tell stories about each other around their fires? Did they see each other as people, or as something other? And we cannot know. The archaeological record is silent on the details of daily interaction. We have only the material remains, the stone tools and bones and occasional art. And from these fragments, we try to reconstruct worlds. There is a particular kind of stone tool associated with the late Neanderthals in Western Europe called the Châtel-Perronian, and it is more sophisticated than earlier Neanderthal tools, with carefully shaped blades and bone implements. And some researchers argue that this represents Neanderthals independently innovating, developing new technologies in response to changing environments, while others argue that it represents cultural exchange with newly arrived modern humans, Neanderthals learning from or imitating the tools of the newcomers. And both interpretations are plausible, and probably both happened in different places. Neanderthals were capable of innovation, that much is clear, but they also were willing to adopt useful technologies from others, which is itself a sign of intelligence, the ability to recognize a better tool and figure out how to make it. But if Neanderthals were so capable, why did they disappear? This is the question that haunts the study of human origins, and there is no single answer, but rather a constellation of factors that together tipped the balance. One factor was probably population size. Neanderthal populations seem to have been small and fragmented. Genetic studies suggest that the total Neanderthal population at any given time was probably fewer than 70,000 individuals, spread across a vast region from Spain to Siberia. And small populations are vulnerable. They are susceptible to genetic drift and inbreeding, and they can be wiped out by local catastrophes, a volcanic eruption, or severe winter or epidemic disease. Whereas modern human populations were larger and more interconnected. Innovations that arose in one group could spread to others, and losses in one region could be compensated by migration from another. Another factor was possibly climate. The period from 50,000 to 40,000 years ago was climatically unstable, with rapid oscillations between warmer and colder conditions. And these fluctuations would have been hard on all human populations, but perhaps harder on Neanderthals, who were specialized for the cold environments of Ice Age Europe. They had stocky builds with short limbs that minimized heat loss, which is ideal for cold climates, but less ideal when temperatures warm. Whereas modern humans had more gracile builds that were better for long-distance running and for heat dissipation. And this might have given modern humans an advantage in a rapidly changing climate, where flexibility was more important than specialization. And then there was technology. Modern humans were innovating rapidly in the Upper Paleolithic, developing new weapon systems like the atlatl or spear thrower, which allowed projectiles to be thrown with much greater force and range, developing nets and traps for fishing and bird hunting, developing eyed needles that allowed the creation of fitted clothing, which was crucial for survival in northern climates. And while Neanderthals had impressive technology for their time, the rate of innovation seems to have been slower. Tool types changed over thousands of years rather than hundreds, and in a competition between groups, the one that innovates faster has an advantage. They can exploit resources more efficiently, defend themselves more effectively, and adapt to changes more quickly. But I keep coming back to the question of consciousness, of what it was like to be a Neanderthal. Did they have the same kind of self-aware, reflective consciousness that we do? Did they contemplate their own existence, fear their own death, wonder about what came after? The burial of the dead suggests they did. Because why bury unless death is seen as significant? Unless there is some sense that the deceased is going somewhere or needs something for a journey. but we cannot know what they thought, cannot access their inner lives. And this is true even for modern humans from the deep past. We have their art and their tools, but not their thoughts. And so we project. We imagine them as thinking like us, but they may have been quite different, their consciousness shaped by different experiences and different concepts. There is a theory in cognitive science that language does not just allow us to communicate thoughts that already exist, but actually shapes the thoughts we can have. That our conceptual categories are constrained by the words we have to describe them. And if this is true, then beings with different languages, or proto-languages, would have had genuinely different ways of experiencing reality, not just different descriptions of the same thing, but different perceptions of what the thing is. And Neanderthals probably had some form of language, but possibly not as complex as ours. And if so, their consciousness might have been more concrete, more tied to immediate sensory experience, less abstract. And this is not to say they were less intelligent. Intelligence can manifest in different ways, but their way of being in the world might have been fundamentally alien to ours in ways we cannot quite grasp. And yet, they painted those dots on the cave wall. 6 red dots, deliberately placed, and dots are about as abstract as you can get. They do not represent anything in nature. They are pure form. And to create abstract forms suggests the ability to think abstractly, to conceive of pattern and repetition as significant in themselves. And so maybe Neanderthals were not so different after all. Maybe they wondered about the same things we wonder about. Maybe they looked up at the stars and felt the same sense of awe and confusion and curiosity. Maybe they told stories around their fires about where they came from and where they were going. And if they did, those stories are lost forever. Lost because they had no writing. Lost because their descendants, if they had any, were absorbed into our population and forgot their origins. And all that remains are the dots on the wall, mute testimony to a consciousness we can never fully know. The extinction of Neanderthals was probably not a single event, but a drawn-out process spanning thousands of years, different populations disappearing at different times. The last known Neanderthal site is in Gibraltar, dated to around 40,000 years ago. And by that time, Neanderthals had already vanished from most of their range, retreating to southern refugia as modern humans expanded and as climate shifted. And there is something tragic about this slow retreat. These last populations clinging to the edges of the continent, their numbers dwindling, perhaps aware that they were the last, perhaps not. And then one day, the last individual died, the last being who carried that particular evolutionary lineage. And with them died all the knowledge and culture and ways of seeing that made them unique. And the world moved on. And eventually, even the memory of them faded, until archaeologists began digging them up in the 19th century and giving them a name. This could happen to us, of course. This is not a comforting thought, but it is worth considering. We are not exempt from the processes that led to Neanderthal extinction. We are animals, subject to the same evolutionary pressures, the same vulnerabilities to climate change and disease and competition. And while we like to think that our technology makes us invulnerable, technology is also what makes us capable of causing our own extinction, through nuclear war or ecological collapse or any number of other catastrophes. And if we do go extinct, if some future species digs up our bones and tools and tries to understand what we were, what will they make of us? Will they see us as we see ourselves? As the pinnacle of evolution, the species that mastered the planet? Or will they see us as we are beginning to see the Neanderthals, as one more experiment that nature tried, successful for a while, but ultimately unsuccessful? But this is too dark. Let me pull back from the abyss. Because humans are still here, still surviving, still adapting, and we have capabilities that Neanderthals and Denisovans did not have. We have writing, which allows us to store knowledge outside our brains. We have science, which gives us a systematic method for understanding the world. We have medicine, which has dramatically reduced mortality from disease and injury. And we have the ability to cooperate at global scales, to coordinate action across billions of individuals. And these capabilities may be sufficient to navigate the challenges ahead, or they may not. But at least we have them, and that gives us a chance. The Pleistocene ended, as I mentioned, around 11,700 years ago with the beginning of the Holocene, our current geological epoch. And this transition was marked by rapid warming as the glaciers retreated, and with this warming came ecological transformation. The great steppes and tundra that covered much of the northern continents were replaced by forests. The herds of mammoths and bison that had been the primary prey of Pleistocene hunters declined and eventually disappeared. And humans had to adapt to new conditions, new prey species, new plant resources, and in some regions, this adaptation took the form of agriculture, the deliberate cultivation of plants and domestication of animals. And this was the Neolithic Revolution, and it set humanity on a path that would lead to cities and civilizations, and eventually to the modern world. But the transition was not immediate or uniform. Agriculture did not appear everywhere at once. It arose independently in several different regions. The Middle East around 11,000 years ago, China around 9,000 years ago, Mesoamerica around 7,000 years ago. And in each region, it involved different crops and different animals: wheat and barley and sheep and goats in the Middle East, rice and millet and pigs in China, maize and beans and squash in Mesoamerica. And these independent inventions of agriculture suggest that it was a natural response to the conditions of the early Holocene, a logical adaptation to a world where the megafauna were gone, and where sedentism became possible due to stable climates and abundant plant resources. But agriculture was not unambiguously good. In fact, early agriculture was probably harder than hunting and gathering in many ways. Farming required long hours of labor, planting and weeding and harvesting, and it tied people to one location. They could not move seasonally to follow resources, and early domesticated crops were less nutritious than the wild plants they replaced. More calories but less diversity of vitamins and minerals, and skeletal evidence shows that early farmers were shorter and less healthy than their hunter-gatherer predecessors, with more dental cavities and more signs of malnutrition and disease. And so, why did they do it? Why did people adopt agriculture if it made their lives harder? And the answer is probably that they did not choose it in a conscious way. Agriculture emerged gradually over generations, people encouraging useful plants, saving seeds, clearing land, and each generation these practices became more intensive, until eventually people were dependent on agriculture. Their populations had grown beyond what hunting and gathering could support, and they could not go back. And this is a pattern we see throughout human history. Innovations that seem like progress at the time, but that lock us into paths that have unforeseen consequences. Agriculture allowed population growth, but it also created inequality, as some individuals accumulated more land or more livestock than others. It created hierarchy and eventually class systems in states. And it created new diseases as humans lived in close proximity to each other and to domesticated animals, facilitating the spread of pathogens. And it created warfare on a scale previously unknown as societies competed for agricultural land. And so agriculture was a double-edged sword. It provided stability and surplus. It allowed specialization and the development of art and science and literature. But it also created new forms of suffering. And you can argue about whether the trade-off was worth it, but the reality is that there was no choice. Once agriculture started, it was self-reinforcing, and within a few thousand years it had spread across most of the world, and the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that had sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years became marginal, confined to environments too harsh or too remote for agriculture. The last true hunter-gatherers persisted into the 20th century in a few isolated regions: the Arctic, the Australian interior, parts of Africa and South America. And anthropologists studied these groups intensively, trying to understand what life had been like for our ancestors. And what they found was surprising. Hunter-gatherers worked fewer hours than farmers, maybe 20 or 30 hours a week on subsistence activities. The rest of the time was leisure, and they had varied diets and generally good health, as long as they were not in contact with agricultural diseases. and their societies were relatively egalitarian, without the hierarchies and inequalities of agricultural civilizations. And this led some anthropologists to call hunter-gatherer life the original affluent society. Affluent not in material possessions, but in time and freedom and social equality. And this challenges the narrative of progress, the idea that each stage of human development was better than the last. Because maybe it was not. Maybe we gave up something valuable when we became farmers, and maybe we gave up even more when we became urbanized and industrialized. But again, there was no choice, or at least no conscious choice. These transitions happened because they solved immediate problems. Agriculture fed more people, cities concentrated resources and enabled trade, industry increased productivity, and each step seemed necessary at the time, and only in retrospect can we see the costs. And even seeing the costs, we cannot go back. There are 8 billion people on Earth now, and we cannot support that many through hunting and gathering. We cannot even support that many through pre-industrial agriculture. We are dependent on industrial food production and modern medicine and global supply chains. And if those systems fail, the consequences will be catastrophic. And so we are locked in. We have to make this work, or we face not just collapse but extinction. And the irony is that the same cognitive abilities that got us into this situation, our ability to innovate and plan and cooperate, are the only things that might get us out. I think about the Pleistocene humans often, especially late at night when the modern world feels oppressive, and I imagine what it would have been like to live in that simpler time, to not know about climate change or nuclear weapons or economic inequality, to have problems that could be solved directly through action, to live in a small group where everyone mattered and everyone was known. And there is romance in this imagination, but it is also a lie, because that world was harsh in ways I cannot truly comprehend. Child mortality rates of 50% or more, death from injury or infection or starvation commonplace, constant physical discomfort from cold or heat or hunger, and the psychological stress of living in a world full of dangers that you could not understand or control. And so I would not actually want to live then. I appreciate antibiotics and central heating and grocery stores too much. But still, I think there was something in that world that we have lost. Some kind of authenticity or directness of experience. And maybe that is what I am really nostalgic for. Not the Pleistocene itself, but the idea of a life that is more immediate, more embodied, less mediated by technology and bureaucracy and abstract systems. And maybe this is why cave paintings affect me so deeply, because they are direct communication across time. A human hand creating an image 30,000 years ago, and my eyes seeing that image now. And in between, nothing but time. The same pigment on the same rock, and the being who made that image had the same kind of consciousness I have, saw the same stars, felt the same wonder and fear and love. And this connection across the abyss of time is profound. It tells me that consciousness is not a modern invention, that the capacity for awe and creativity and symbolic thought is ancient, is part of what it means to be human, and that whatever we have built on top of that foundation, cities and agriculture and industry and internet, we still carry that Pleistocene consciousness within us. And maybe that is both our curse and our salvation. The curse because we are maladapted to the world we have created. The salvation because that ancient consciousness still knows things, still remembers what it means to be human in a more fundamental sense. The Pleistocene shaped us, made us what we are. And understanding that is not just an academic exercise. It is a way of understanding ourselves, our drives and desires and fears, why we crave connection and status and meaning, why we are capable of both altruism and violence, why we create art and music and stories, and why we are haunted by questions about who we are and why we exist. These are not modern concerns. They are ancient. They are part of the consciousness that emerged when our ancestors sat around fires in the African savanna or in European caves, looking up at the stars and wondering. And we are still wondering, still asking the same questions. And maybe that is what it means to be human, to be the animal that asks why, that cannot rest in simple existence but must search for meaning. And that search began in the Pleistocene, and it continues now, and it will continue as long as there are humans, or whatever we evolve into, lighting fires against the dark, and telling stories about where we came from and where we are going. There is an aspect of Pleistocene life that we rarely consider because it leaves no archaeological trace, and that is the role of dreaming. Because humans have always dreamed, this is a universal feature of our neurology. We spend roughly 2 hours every night in REM sleep, experiencing vivid, hallucinatory narratives that feel absolutely real while we are in them. And our Pleistocene ancestors would have had the same experience, lying down to sleep after a day of hunting or gathering, and then finding themselves in another world. A world where the dead might speak, where animals transformed into humans, or humans into animals, where impossible things happened. And they would wake not knowing what these experiences meant, but knowing they meant something. Because dreams feel significant. They carry an emotional weight that mere random neural firing should not produce. And I think this must have shaped early human spirituality in profound ways. Because how else would you explain dreams except as voyages to another realm? And if there is another realm, a spirit world that you visit each night, then that changes everything about how you understand reality. The physical world becomes just one layer, and beneath or beyond it is something else. Something populated by spirits and ancestors and perhaps gods. And this is the foundation of shamanism, which appears in nearly every human culture. The idea that certain individuals can travel to the spirit world while awake, through trance or ritual or psychoactive plants, and bring back knowledge or healing or guidance. And shamanism is probably very ancient, possibly predating modern humans, because the capacity for altered states of consciousness is built into our neurology. And the interpretation of those states as spiritually significant would have been almost inevitable. There are cave paintings that some researchers interpret as shamanistic, images of therianthropes, beings that are part human and part animal, a human figure with a bison head, or a figure with antlers, or bird-headed human figures. And these are found across different cultures and different time periods, which suggests they represent something fundamental about human consciousness. Perhaps they depict shamans in animal form, transformed during trance states. Or perhaps they depict spirits or gods. Or perhaps the distinction between these categories was not clear to the people who made them. The boundaries between human and animal, between physical and spiritual, were more fluid than they are for us. And the images were attempts to capture experiences that transcended ordinary waking reality. One of the most famous and most enigmatic of these images is in the cave of Les Trois Frères in France, a figure known as the Sorcerer. It is engraved and painted on the wall of a deep chamber, and it shows a being with the body of a human, the antlers of a stag, the eyes of an owl, the ears of a wolf, and the tail of a horse. And it dominates the chamber, positioned above all the other animal images. And what it represents has been debated for decades. Some see it as a shaman in ceremonial costume, others as a deity or spirit, still others as a mythological being. And we will never know what the creators intended. But the image has a power that transcends interpretation. There is something uncanny about it, something that speaks to a consciousness that perceived the world differently than we do. And this brings me to a speculation, which is that Pleistocene humans may have been more comfortable with ambiguity and paradox than we are. Their thinking was less constrained by logic and categories. A being could be both human and animal, both living and dead, both here and in the spirit world. And this was not a problem to be resolved, but simply the way things were. And modern cognitive science actually supports this in a way, because studies of contemporary hunter-gatherers and of children show that magical thinking is more prevalent when people are closely connected to nature and when they have not been trained in formal logic. And this does not mean they were less intelligent. It means their intelligence operated differently, more holistically, more comfortable with contradiction. And this mode of thought may have been advantageous in a world where survival depended on reading subtle signs and patterns, where intuition was as important as analysis. But it also means that the boundary between myth and reality was porous. A hunter tracking an animal might genuinely believe he was communing with the animal's spirit, asking permission to kill it. And this belief was not metaphorical. It was literal. The animal had a spirit, and that spirit needed to be respected. And this created a relationship with nature that was fundamentally different from ours. We see nature as a resource to be exploited. They saw it as a community of beings with whom they were in relationship. And when they killed an animal, they felt genuine grief and gratitude. And they performed rituals to maintain the balance, to ensure that the animals would continue to give themselves to the hunters. And this was not primitive superstition. It was a sophisticated ecological ethic, embedded in a spiritual framework. There is evidence from many hunter-gatherer cultures that animals were seen as persons. Not human persons, but persons nonetheless, with their own perspectives and agency and social relationships. And this animistic worldview, where everything is alive and aware, where rocks and rivers and trees have spirits, this was probably universal among Pleistocene humans, and it created a lived experience of the world as enchanted, as full of meaning and intention. And every event had significance. A storm was not just meteorology, it was the anger of spirits. A successful hunt was not just luck, it was the gift of the animal's spirit. And this created a narrative coherence to life that we have lost. We see randomness and mechanism. They saw story and relationship. And I am not sure which is more accurate, or whether accuracy is even the right criterion, because their worldview allowed them to survive and thrive for hundreds of thousands of years. And ours has brought us to the brink of ecological collapse in just a few centuries. The concept of the supernatural is itself a modern invention. It only makes sense if you first establish a category of the natural, the physical world governed by impersonal laws. And then you need a second category for everything that does not fit, spirits and souls and gods. But for Pleistocene humans, there was no such distinction. There was just reality. And reality included visible and invisible dimensions, physical and spiritual aspects. And these were not separate, but interpenetrating. The spirit world was not elsewhere, it was right here, coexisting with the physical. And you could perceive it if you knew how, through dreams or visions or ritual. And this was not belief in the sense of accepting a proposition without evidence. It was experience. They experienced the spirit world as directly as they experienced the physical world. And maybe they were right. This is an unsettling thought, but worth considering. Maybe our materialist worldview, our insistence that only the physical is real, is the aberration, the anomaly. And maybe the animistic worldview was not primitive but sophisticated, a genuine perception of aspects of reality that we have trained ourselves not to see. And I am not saying I believe this exactly. I am a product of modern education and scientific thinking. But I am saying that the confidence with which we dismiss pre-scientific worldviews may be unwarranted. We know some things they did not, physics and chemistry and biology. But they may have known some things we do not, about consciousness and relationship and meaning. And those things may be as real and as important as the things we know. There is a phenomenon reported by many people who spend extended time in wilderness, particularly solo, where the boundaries of self begin to dissolve, where you feel yourself as part of the landscape rather than separate from it, where trees and rocks and animals feel like presences, like beings you are in relationship with. And this is often described as mystical or spiritual. But it may also be a natural state of consciousness that emerges when you are immersed in nature, without the constant stimulation and distraction of modern life. And Pleistocene humans lived in this state all the time. They were never separate from nature, never in an artificial environment. And so their consciousness was probably very different from ours, less boundaried, more fluid, more connected to the non-human world. And this has implications for how we think about consciousness itself, because we tend to assume that consciousness is produced by the brain, that it is a property of individual organisms. But what if that is wrong? What if consciousness is more like a field that brains tap into rather than produce? And what if some aspects of consciousness are shared, collective, transpersonal? This sounds mystical, and it is. But it is also worth noting that many indigenous cultures have concepts like this. The idea that consciousness extends beyond individual brains, that we can access the consciousness of our ancestors or of the land itself. And while these ideas do not fit into our scientific frameworks, that does not necessarily mean they are false. It might mean our frameworks are incomplete. The archaeologist David Lewis Williams has proposed that much Upper Paleolithic cave art was created in altered states of consciousness, and that the deep caves were chosen specifically because they facilitated these states: the darkness, the silence, the disorientation, the flicker of torchlight creating moving shadows. All of this would induce trance, and in trance, the artist would see visions, and they would paint what they saw. And this explains some of the strange features of cave art. The way animals seem to emerge from the rock surface, as if they are coming from inside the stone. The way images are layered and superimposed. The way certain natural features of the cave are incorporated into the art. A bulge in the rock becomes the shoulder of a bison. A crack becomes the line of a horse's back. And this suggests that the artists saw the animals as already present in the rock, and they were just revealing them, making visible what was already there in the spirit world. And if this interpretation is correct, then the caves themselves were not art galleries, they were temples. Or, more accurately, they were portals, liminal spaces where the boundary between worlds was thin. And by going deep into the earth, into darkness, into the womb of the Earth Mother, if you want to use that metaphor, humans could access the spirit realm and communicate with the animals whose bodies sustained them. And the paintings were not representations, but presences. The spirit of the bison was actually there in the image, and by painting it, the shaman was performing a sacred act, ensuring the continued abundance of game, maintaining the reciprocal relationship between humans and animals. This is so far from how we think about art. For us, art is aesthetic. It is about beauty, or expression, or provocation. But Pleistocene art was functional. It had power. It did something in the world. And the artists were not artists in our sense. They were specialists, shamans or ritualists, performing acts of cosmic importance. And the distinction between practical and spiritual did not exist. The hunt was spiritual. The preparation of tools was spiritual. The telling of stories around the fire was spiritual. Because everything was embedded in a web of relationships and meanings that extended beyond the merely physical. And I find myself wondering what it would be like to live in that world. To perceive reality as alive and intentional. To feel yourself in constant communication with forces and beings beyond your understanding. And on one level it sounds terrifying. To be surrounded by powers you cannot control. To be dependent on the goodwill of spirits. But on another level, it sounds less lonely than our modern existence. Because you are never really alone. You are always in relationship. With your group, with the animals, with the land, with your ancestors, with the spirits. And every action has meaning because it affects these relationships. And your life is not just a series of random events, but a story. A narrative with purpose and direction, even if you do not fully understand what that purpose is. The Pleistocene was not a static period. I should emphasize this, because we sometimes talk about it as if conditions were constant. But in fact, the climate was highly variable. The glacial and interglacial cycles I mentioned earlier were not smooth transitions, but punctuated by abrupt shifts, the Dansgaard-Oeschger events. Rapid warming periods lasting decades or centuries, followed by gradual cooling, and the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to glacial conditions 11,000 years ago that lasted 1,200 years. And these rapid changes would have been catastrophic for human populations, forcing migrations, causing local extinctions, creating bottlenecks. And the humans who survived were the ones who could adapt quickly, who could learn new hunting strategies, find new food sources, develop new technologies. And this constant pressure to adapt is probably what drove the rapid evolution of human cognition. We became the most adaptable species on Earth because we had to be. And adaptation was not just physical or technological, it was also social and cultural. Humans survived Ice Age conditions not just by making better tools, but by cooperating more effectively, sharing resources, caring for the vulnerable. And this required sophisticated social cognition, the ability to track relationships, remember obligations, detect cheaters, form coalitions. And much of our brain's computational power is devoted to social cognition. We are always modeling other minds, trying to figure out what others are thinking and feeling and intending. And this ability is unique to humans, at least in its sophistication. Other primates have theory of mind to some degree, but we take it to another level. We can model not just what someone is thinking, but what they think we are thinking, and what they think we think they are thinking. Multiple levels of recursion. And this allows for incredible social complexity, but it also creates anxiety, because we are constantly worried about what others think of us, constantly performing for an imagined audience. And this too is a Pleistocene adaptation that persists into the modern world. Status anxiety is built into us because in Pleistocene groups, status mattered intensely. High-status individuals had better access to food and mates. They had more influence over group decisions. Their genes were more likely to be passed on. And so we evolved to care about status, to compete for it, to feel good when we rise in status and terrible when we fall. And this made sense in a world of small, face-to-face groups where everyone knew everyone else and where your reputation was everything. But it makes less sense now when we interact with thousands of strangers and when status is often arbitrary and based on factors we cannot control. And yet we still feel the same emotions, the same drive to impress, the same fear of humiliation. And this is exhausting. And much of modern mental health problems, anxiety and depression, stem from this mismatch. We are trying to navigate a social world our brains were not designed for. But there was also beauty in that Pleistocene world, and I do not want to make it seem like it was all struggle and hardship. There were moments of joy. The successful hunt followed by feasting, the birth of a child, the telling of stories and singing of songs around the fire, the creation of art. And these moments of joy were probably more intense than ours, more vivid, because they existed in contrast to the hardship. Pleasure meant more when it was rare and had to be earned. And there was a kind of presence, an attention to the immediate moment that we have lost, because they could not afford to be distracted. Survival required constant awareness, noticing tracks, interpreting weather signs, remembering the location of water sources. And this kept them grounded in their bodies and their senses in ways we are not. We spend much of our time in our heads, worrying about the future or regretting the past, but they lived in the now. Not because they were enlightened, because they had to. And there was the night sky, which I have mentioned before but which deserves more attention, because the Pleistocene night sky was something we can barely imagine. In the darkest places we can access today, far from cities, you can see perhaps 3,000 stars with the naked eye. But in the Pleistocene, with no light pollution anywhere, no fires beyond your own camp, the number of visible stars would have been much higher, perhaps 5,000 or more, and the Milky Way would have been a dominant feature, casting enough light to see by on moonless nights. And this spectacle would have been visible every clear night. Not a rare event, but a constant presence. And it must have provoked wonder and speculation. Did they try to understand what stars were? Did they develop cosmologies, explanations for the structure of the universe? And almost certainly yes, all cultures do this. The human mind cannot tolerate mystery without trying to explain it. And their explanations would have been mythological rather than scientific. Stories about gods and heroes and ancestors placed in the sky. And different groups would have had different stories, different constellations, different meanings. But all of them would have looked up and tried to make sense of what they saw, tried to find pattern and purpose in the distribution of lights across the darkness. And in doing this, they were doing the same thing we do with science, trying to understand, trying to create a coherent narrative that explains our observations. The difference is only in method. They used story and intuition. We use mathematics and experiment. But the impulse is the same. And they would have noticed things we miss, because we rarely look at the sky anymore. And when we do, it is usually briefly. but they watched the sky every night for their entire lives, and over decades and generations, they would have noticed the patterns, the way certain stars appeared in certain seasons, the way the moon waxed and waned in a reliable cycle, the way planets moved against the background of fixed stars, and they would have used this knowledge practically, for navigation and for tracking time, but also spiritually, seeing in the movements of celestial bodies the will of gods or the turning of cosmic wheels. And this was astronomy. Not in our technical sense, but in the original sense, the study of the stars and what they mean. Some researchers have proposed that certain Paleolithic artifacts are astronomical, marks on bones or stones that track lunar cycles, scratches arranged in groups of 28 or 29, suggesting month-long counts. And if this is correct, then humans were doing quantitative astronomy at least 30,000 years ago, maybe longer. And this is remarkable because it shows abstract thought, the ability to count, to keep records, to recognize repeating patterns over long timescales. And it suggests that the cognitive capacity for mathematics is not a recent development but ancient, built into our brains by Pleistocene selection pressures, because being able to count and track patterns had survival value. And the same cognitive abilities that allowed tracking of lunar cycles could be applied to other domains, tracking animal populations, remembering locations of seasonal resources, planning multi-step tool production. But I keep coming back to the question of what it felt like, what the subjective experience was. And this is of course impossible to know with certainty, but we can make educated guesses based on neurology and anthropology. The Pleistocene human brain was essentially identical to ours. Same size, same structure, same neurotransmitters. And so their emotions were probably similar. They felt fear and joy and love and grief. They bonded with their children and their mates. They mourned their dead. They celebrated their successes. And in these fundamental ways, they were us, and we are them. And the 100,000 or 200,000 years that separate us from the earliest Homo sapiens is nothing in evolutionary terms, a blink. Not enough time for significant cognitive evolution. And so we carry their consciousness, their ways of feeling and thinking, adapted to a world that no longer exists, but still active, still shaping how we experience reality. And this is both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it means we are not alone. We are part of a lineage stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, all those ancestors surviving and reproducing and eventually leading to us. And we carry them in our genes and our brains and our behaviors. We are their continuation. And disturbing because it means we are shaped by forces we do not control, by evolutionary pressures that optimized us for a world that is gone. And we are trying to live in a radically different world with brains that were designed for something else. And this creates suffering, a sense of not fitting, of being out of place. And maybe this is the source of the uniquely human sense of alienation, the feeling that we do not belong, that something is wrong, that we have lost something important. And what we have lost is the Pleistocene, the world we were made for, and we can never get it back. We can only move forward into an uncertain future, carrying with us the gifts and burdens of our deep past. The more I learn about the Pleistocene, the more I feel a strange grief, mourning for something I never had, for a way of life I never experienced. And I know this is irrational. The past was not paradise. It was brutal and short and full of suffering. But it was also real in a way that modern life often does not feel real. It was direct, embodied, immediate. And there was a kind of meaning built into the structure of daily life. Everything you did mattered. Your contribution to the group, your relationships, your skills, and you knew your place in the web of life. You were not alienated from nature or from other humans or from yourself, or at least not in the ways we are. And maybe what I am really mourning is not the Pleistocene specifically, but the possibility of that kind of life. A life where meaning is intrinsic rather than something you have to construct, where purpose is given by your role in the community rather than something you have to search for, where you are embedded in relationships rather than isolated in your individual subjectivity. But perhaps I am romanticizing again. projecting my own desires onto a past I do not understand. It is easy to imagine the Pleistocene as authentic and meaningful when you are sitting in a comfortable room with electricity and internet. But if I were actually there, cold and hungry and scared, I would probably long for the comfort and security of modern life. And this is the paradox. We cannot go back even if we wanted to, and we cannot go forward without carrying the past with us. And so we exist in this strange, liminal state, no longer Pleistocene humans, but not yet whatever we are becoming, caught between worlds. And maybe that is what it means to be human, to always be in transition, always becoming, never fully at home anywhere, always reaching for something just beyond our grasp. And maybe that restless searching is both our curse and our glory, the thing that makes us suffer and the thing that makes us human.